Make sure your Bibles are still open there to Exodus chapter 13. All the way by faith, and with the idea is off we go. Off we go. The children of Israel had been in slavery and bondage for 400 years. Years before that, God had promised Abraham that his descendants were going to be taken into slavery, taken into Egypt, and for 400 years they would serve. But at the end of that 400 years, God would deliver them and then take them into the promised land. So now we're at that window, we're at that time. Moses had been raised up, ready to deliver them, take them out of Egypt and take them toward the promised land. God had used 10 plagues to demonstrate His power, to demonstrate His ability, to demonstrate He is the only one true God. And each of those plagues had something to do to show that their gods, because they had many gods in Egypt, was not real, was not powerful, but our powerful God is the one true God. And He had 10 plagues. The last plague, as we know, is the one that we think about so often. It was the plague of the blood, the death of the firstborn. And that's what's referred to in this passage. God told the children of Israel, and He told all of Egypt for that matter, He says that they were to take a lamb, a perfect lamb, a pure lamb, a male lamb, picturing the Lord Jesus Christ. And they were supposed to take that lamb and put it up, make sure it was not sickly and didn't have any problems. Then they were going to kill that lamb on a particular night and take that lamb and put the blood on the side and across the top of the doorposts of their house. Then they were supposed to eat that lamb that night with their shoes on, their staff in their hand, girded, ready to go. He said, because this is the night I'm going to deliver you. This is the night I'm going to take you out. And He says that night is called the Passover, because He said, I'm going to go through Egypt. He said, I'm going to look. And He said, every household, I'm going to kill the firstborn. Every single one, whether it be an animal, whether it be king, whether it be pauper, whether it be slave, I'm going to kill the firstborn of every household unless I see the blood. He said, if I see the blood, in other words, you've believed me, you're trusting me, and you're trusting in that shed blood, which is a picture of trusting in the shed blood of Jesus Christ. He said, when I see that blood, I will pass over you. We sing that song many times, I'll pass over you, and that's what it's talking about. That promise of when He saw the blood of the Lamb on the doorpost, in other words, people trusting God, what He can do, not what they can do, He said, I'll pass over you. So we're just experiencing that Passover. When the Jews have those Passover meals, that's what it's celebrating, the Passover. So here they are, they've just had the Passover, and now King Pharaoh has just said, all right, go, get out of here. And God is giving him instructions on how to start out. It's time to go. Can you imagine the excitement? I mean, these folks, they've been in bondage for 400 years. Now, they weren't 400 years old. They may have felt like it, but so they've been generation upon generation of in slavery, and now the fulfillment of the promise, the fulfillment of the delivery, here they are getting ready to take off, not just to go where they want to, but to the land God had provided for them, the land God had promised them. Oh, what an exciting time that was. But He says, I need to teach you a couple principles on how to start out. You and I trust, if you're saved today, you're on your spiritual journey to the promised land. Promised land in the Bible is not a picture of heaven, though we sing about it and we talk about it, because in heaven there's no battles, in heaven there's no sin. But the promised land is the successful Christian life. The Christian life, the place where God wants you and I to live, where He would have us serve Him, where we can grow, where we can minister to other people. That's the successful Christian life. And God is taking us then from salvation to that promised land. And it's a journey that we have to be on. And so we need to know also how to start out, how to get going. So here we go. Very simple thoughts this morning, but you and I need to focus on, am I ready to start? Have I started? If not, maybe you need to go back and set some key values to get you started, or remember some values so that you can proceed along the way. So, message this morning, here we go. I hope you're ready. I hope you pay attention. Stay with me. Number one, very simple. We need to mark the day. We need to mark the day. I think too many people are on the journey, but they've never had a beginning. They think they're on the journey to spiritual life. They think they're on the journey to the successful Christian life, but they've never really had a day to start the journey. They've never really had a day where they've trusted Christ as Savior. They're really not really born again. They're really not saved, but they're struggling to live the journey, struggling to make it through the journey, but they're not even saved. So he starts out here, he said, before we go, he said, you need to mark this day. In fact, in chapter 12, it talks about to the very day God had promised they were delivered. By the way, I'm glad God's in control. To the very day, the very night they were going to go. So he says, first thing you do is mark the day. Look at verse number 3, if you would, of chapter 13. And Moses said unto the people, remember this day. He said, you got to mark it down. In fact, this day, this Passover, said they're going to do it every year as a remembrance. He said, you got to remember. You need to mark it down. And Moses said unto the people, remember this day. What day is that, Moses? What's significant about this day? In which ye came out from Egypt, out of the house of bondage. For by strength of hand the Lord brought you out from this place. There shall no leavened bread be eaten. This day came ye out in the month Abib. So it's the start, if you will. So mark this day. It's a start of commemoration. It's a starting day of commemoration. He said they're going to do this. God's going to have them do this every year. They're going to commemorate. They're going to celebrate. He says, you mark this day down and celebrate. And you say, what in the world they're celebrating? It's the day they were delivered. He said, we're going to celebrate because this is the day God brought us out of slavery. This is the day God brought us out of bondage. This is the day that God delivered us. So you and I, if we're putting the application of this, headed to our successful Christian life, headed to our promised land, we need to mark the day that we were saved. Talk to me now. Well, you've got to mark the day, commemorate the day. How in the world are you going to make it through the journey if you can't celebrate and remember the fact that you are born again and the day you got saved? He says, mark it down. Remember, because this is the day, this starting off, this going out into the wilderness and going over to the promised land is the day we were delivered. They were saved. Oh, he says, you got to remember what it was like before that you got saved. He says, now that you're delivered, now you're set free. They were going from slavery to freedom. What a change, what a difference in their life. And it was also the day by strong hand God brought them out. Who brought them out, class? God did. Oh, I tell you what, it's God. In verses 3, 9, and 14, it reminds them it was God's strong hand. God's strong hand that delivered them. So he said, before you start out, first thing I do, he says, you got to mark the day. It's a day of commemoration, a day of celebration. He said, you got to remember that. I have to ask you, do you remember the day you were saved? I hope so. They're a little quiet on there. I hope you know the day that you were saved. Remember that day. And by the way, your salvation is also by the strong hand of God. You're not saved by your good works. You're not saved by your efforts. You're not saved by this preacher. You're not saved by this church. You're not saved by baptismal waters. You're not saved by joining the church. You are saved by the strong hand of God. Amen. When you realize you're a sinner headed for hell, but Christ paid the price and you call upon Him and you trust Him and then God saves you by His hand. You need to know the day that you were saved. Again, I go back to my introductory remarks. Too many Christians are struggling with their journey to the promised land because they've never really had a beginning. They don't have a day to mark. They don't have a day to put it down. They've just kind of, all the time I'm talking with folks when I'm out door knocking or visiting with folks, try to witness to them. Many times they'll say, well, I've always been saved. Nobody has always been saved. There's a time in your life, a place in your life where you've trusted Christ. So he says, for these folks, they're going to go over and over every year. They're going to step back and say, wait a minute, remember how God delivered us. Remember how God freed us. Remember how God changed us. You need to know that day. They knew the day. It's on their calendar. Every single year they celebrate the Passover, celebrating and being reminded of that day. Do you remember the day you were saved? I believe you must. The Apostle Paul did. On the road to Damascus, remember on the road to Damascus, he got knocked off his horse with that bright light and God spoke to him. And he said, Lord, what will you have me to do? Every time you talk to the Apostle Paul could always talk about the day he got saved, the day he came to know the Lord. When he stood before the different judges, when he stood before different trials, he's always said, let me tell you about the day I got saved. How I was on the road to Damascus and I was going that way to persecute. I was persecuting Christians. I hated Christianity. But God showed up and knocked me down and changed my mind and changed my heart. And now I'm preaching His gospel. He knew what happened to him. He knew the day and how it changed. I think of Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus knew the day that he was saved. We sing that song all the time about Zacchaeus, the wee little man. But when Zacchaeus got saved in Luke 19:8, Zacchaeus stood and said unto the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, And if I have taken anything from any man by false accusation, I restore him fourfold. And Jesus saith unto him, This day is salvation come to this house, for as much as he also is the son of Abraham. When Zacchaeus got saved, when Zacchaeus was in that tree looking down, and Jesus stopped and said, Zacchaeus, I got to come to your house today. And he came down and he came and believed on the Lord Jesus Christ, and he got saved, and it changed his life. Zacchaeus knew the day when he got saved. He said, Jesus came by. Matthew knew it, I believe. When Matthew was at the seat of custom, he was that cheating tax collector. And Jesus said, follow me, and he left all and came. Matthew could take it back. You go all through the Bible, everywhere, people know the day they trusted Christ. They know the day. They knew what they were like before. They knew how they came to know Christ, and they know how it changed them. Oh, if you don't have a day, I started to say I'm not trying to make you doubt salvation, but if you don't have a day, if you don't have an event, you may not know the day. You may not say, no, it was March 12th in 1972, but you'll know the day. It's kind of like your wedding. You may forget your anniversary date, but you remember you got married because you were there. And it changed your life. So it is with salvation. He says, you got to mark this day. You say, preacher, why should I mark it down? Why should it be so important? Because that's the day you passed from death to life. God talks about when we get saved, we pass from death to life. We pass from darkness to light. 2 Corinthians 5:17. Therefore, if any man be in Christ. So, preacher, what does that mean? It means if you're saved. That's what it says. If any man be in Christ, whoever's saved, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. In other words, everything changes. When you get saved, everything changes. You're not going to hell, you're going to heaven. You're not by yourself, you've got the Holy Spirit inside. Everything in your life changes. You have a new nature that comes in. And so here, before they start on the journey, he said, all right, Pharaoh said to go. He said, but before you go, mark the day. Mark the day things changed. Mark the day and what happened. Mark what happened this night. Mark what happened, how the blood was there, and how you trusted the blood, and how you trusted me, and how you went from slavery to freedom. You mark the day, a day of celebration. Why do they need to remember that day? Why do they need to mark it? Same reason you and I do, because they needed to remember God's power on the trip. That's why he says, mark this day, remember this day, how the strong hand of God brought you out from the enemy. How the strong hand of God changed your life. How the strong hand of God did that. He said, you need to remember that. Why? Because pretty soon there's going to be a day where you're going to need His power in your life. There's going to come a day where you say, God, I can't do it, but I know that you can. Aren't you glad there's nothing too hard for the Lord? Boy, He's got all the power. He said, mark this day before you head out. Why? Because you got to remember, it's 4 times He said, by the strong hand of the Lord, He brought us out. Boy, so they were going to get out there and get in the wilderness. The enemies were going to come. The battles were going to come. A bunch of slaves, they weren't soldiers yet. They had been slaves all their life, but they got out there, and we know the story, for example, how Moses got up there on the top of the hill with the rod of God in his hand, and when he raised it up, the children of Israel in the valley won the battle. When his arms got tired and came down, the enemy began to win. They need to know God's power was there to defeat their enemies. And all the battles that would come, God's power. That's why you need to mark it down. I remember just as clear as if it was yesterday, the day I got saved, and how it changed my life and what God did. And so when those days come, and I said, well, I just don't have the power, but He does. They need to remember, mark the day to remember God's power when they need it. They need to mark the day to remember God's compassion when they don't feel it. Well, God showed up. Remember when He went to Moses, He says, I've heard the cry of the people. He said, yes, it's on my schedule to deliver them. Yes, I know the day I'm going to do that. He said, but what moved me to come to you, Moses, was I heard the cry of the people, their affliction and their bondage. Aren't you glad? Even as we just heard the special song, Jesus cares. Aren't you glad God cares? I was, again, talking to a young man just the other day, and was so angry and bitter with God because he didn't think God cares, because he was sleeping in his car, and because he didn't have a job and all the possessions he thought he ought to have, and he didn't think God cares. Oh, God cares. God cares. The children of Israel, when they were going to be out there and the water was gone, when the food was skimpy, when it was getting hot, when all the things began to happen to them, they had to stop and say, no, God does care. How do you know? It says, because I've marked the day where God showed how much He cared by coming and delivering me out of the hand of the bondage, out of the hand of Pharaoh, out of the hand of the world, and how He changed me from slavery to freedom. Boy, preacher, how do I know God cares? If you're saved, you know God cares. If you're saved, you know He went to the cross and took your hell and my hell on Himself. He cares. Don't ever think God doesn't care. You say, but if God cares, I wouldn't get sick. By the way, people get sick. That's an amazing thing. People say, well, God would heal everybody. God doesn't heal everybody. Can you imagine what a mess we'd be if God healed everybody and nobody died? Death comes because of sin. But you say, but God doesn't care. He does care. That's why He catches our tears and puts them in a bottle. That's why we can go to the throne of grace and find mercy and help in time of need. Mark the day that you got saved. Mark it down. He said, children of Israel, remember this day, because you're going to need to remember God's power. You're going to need to remember God's compassion on this journey, on this trip where it seems to get so hard. You need to remember that you're in God's plan. You need to remember God's plan. He said, for 400 years, God said they were going to be in slavery. And He says, now they're delivered, and now He's going to take us out. We've got to remember we're in God's plan. No matter what else is going on, we need to mark the day. What day I got saved, I got plugged into God's plan. I got plugged into God's direction. And we may not understand it all, but it is God's plan. Wow. Mark the day. It's a day of commemoration. He said, remember. Remember how God brought you out. Number 2. Mark the day because it's a day that starts consecration. It's a day that starts consecration. Consecration means a solemn dedication to some purpose or service or God. It's a solemn dedication to a special purpose or service or God. It literally means an association with the sacred. In other words, I'm consecrated unto God. So it's a day of consecration that starts consecration. Are you still with me this morning? I don't think we're going to get it all, so you got to catch what you got right here. Chapter 13, notice in verse number 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, sanctify me all the firstborn, that whatsoever openeth the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and of beast, it is mine. So God says, you tell the children of Israel, firstborn is mine. Every animal, every beast, every male child is mine. But before Moses told him that, he reminded them of something. Look at verse number 2 then, or verse number 3. And Moses said unto the people, remember this day. He said, before I tell you what God told me to tell you about this firstborn, He said, let me make you remember what God has done for you. Let me remind you and set the tone that making sure that you're delivered, make sure that you've been redeemed, make sure that you've been bought, make sure you know that God cares about you, make sure you know that God's got a plan for you. He said, I'm going to tell you that before I tell you about the consecration, the dedication God is also wanting. Now, He asked for something very particular. He asked for the firstborn. Now, in this passage and elsewhere, every firstborn, if it was a clean animal, in Deuteronomy, if it was a clean animal, they sacrificed it. So if you had an animal here, no matter what it was your best cow, your best sheep, if it was a clean animal, you take that firstborn and sacrifice it to God. If it was an unclean animal, and it's in the Scripture there, in other words, it's not one God would take as a sacrifice, and we just read it, you could redeem it. In other words, you could buy it. So here I've got a donkey, and the donkey's not a clean animal. But boy, I can sure use this donkey. I've been working hard for this donkey. He said, all right. He said, I don't want you to sacrifice it because it's unclean, but you can buy it back. You can take a lamb and buy it back from me, and then you can actually use that. He said, but if you don't redeem it, it's unclean, but it's mine. God said, even if it's unclean, it's mine. If you don't redeem it, you can't have it. You got to break its neck. In other words, you don't get it either. It's mine unless you buy it back from me. He said, the firstborn are all mine. If it's a human male, God wouldn't want him to kill him, all right? He said, it's still mine. You must redeem him. You must buy him back from me. He's mine, but I want you to have him, and you're not going to kill the babies. God's not for killing babies. God is not for killing babies. And so he says, but you need to buy him back. You need to redeem him. In fact, in Luke 22, remember where Simeon was there when Jesus was first born? It says in Luke 22, or Luke 2, verse 22, and when the days of her purification according to the law of Moses was accomplished, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every male that openeth the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to that which is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. So even Joseph and Mary, they brought Jesus, the firstborn, the male, they took him there to redeem him by giving the animals. Aren't you glad they were spiritual enough to know the Word of God? That was the law. And so next time you read that about them, that's what they're doing. They were showing up there at the temple because here's the firstborn and he's a male. And so therefore I must sacrifice or redeem him back. So God says, as you get into the promised land, he says the first animal, the firstborn, is mine. That reminds us, are you still with me? Because we're going to go on this journey and you better understand how to get started. And we got to start consecration before you go forward. You know what to give and consecrate unto God. He didn't want the second one. He says, I want the first one. He said, I don't want the third one. I want the first one. I don't want the fifth one. I want the first one. It's the law of first fruits. How many have heard of the expression, the law of first fruits? In other words, God gets the first. God gets the first. The first. Example, Exodus 22:29. Thou shalt not delay to offer the first of thy ripe fruits and of thy liquors. The firstborn of thy son shalt thou give unto me. Like the tithe, you give the first 10%. So this law of first fruits, God wants what's first. You say, why does he want that? Very quickly. First fruits is an act of faith. It's an act of faith. When you brought in that first animal, let's say this is your first cattle you've got, and there's my first animal, and he said, but now I got to give it to God. But I'm doing that in faith that God's going to continue to provide. In faith, God's going to give me the next one. In faith, I'm going to give him. But if I hold this moment because I don't think I can trust God. I don't think I can trust God with this animal. I'm going to wait till I get another one, and then I'll give that one to God. No, God says, I want you to be consecrated. He said, you give me the first. I think I told you the story about the fish the other day. Missionary was on the field. There's an example of faith and first fruits. Missionary was on the field and he was in Africa and he was teaching the people, they were getting saved, and he was teaching them about tithing and first fruits. He said the 1 out of every 10 belongs to God. The first out of 10 belongs to God. And so a little boy started showing up and said every morning he'd knock on the door. He said, here's my tithe, and hand the preacher a fish. He said, I usually get about 10 fish a day. Here's my tithe. Next day he came back, knocked on the door early in the morning, said, here's my tithe. Here's my fish. Third day, knocked on the door, here's my tithe. And he said, finally the preacher said, I see that fish. Where are the other 9? He said, oh, they're still in the river. I have to go catch them. That's first fruits. He said, here it is, and I'm trusting by faith for the rest. That's why you tithe before you pay your bills. That's why you tithe before you pay your bills. Yeah, because it's the first ones. Listen, you say, well, I don't have enough money. I guarantee you start robbing from God, you're not going to have enough money. Whew. First fruits is an act of faith. Is an act of faith. So he said, this is what I want you to consecrate yourself to me. He said, you're heading off to the promised land. He said, but you start. I love it. Moses, before he told him this, God told him, he says, I want you to tell them that they're going to have to give me their firstborn. Moses said, before I tell you that, let me remind you what God has done for you. Amen. No big deal. He saved me. He delivered me. He's got all the power, and by faith. And if he wants the first, that is fine with me because of all the things he's done for me. First fruits is an act of faith. Number 2, first fruits is an act of gratitude. It's an act of gratitude. Oh, just remember what God has done for you. And if God says this is going to be pleasing in His sight, I'll be glad to give what's pleasing in His sight. That's why in Romans 12:1, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, because God is merciful, because God has saved us, because God's taken us to heaven, even though we deserve hell, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Whoa, it's just an act of gratitude, the mercies of God. Wow. He saved me. He's taken me to heaven. He's given me a life eternal. Wow. I just don't mind being consecrated unto Him, giving Him what belonged to Him in the first place. Wow. Mark the day. First fruits is an act of faith. It's an act of gratitude, and it's an act of obedience. It's an act of obedience. God just says it. That ought to be enough. That ought to be enough. Consecration, because I've consecrated, given myself to God. Wow. Preacher, I'm ready for my journey. Are you? Have you marked the day? Can you say, yep, I was saved on that day? If you don't have that day, I can't tell you whether you're saved or not. But if you can't go back to some place in your mind, some time in your mind where you realize you were a sinner headed for hell and realize Jesus died for you and you called upon Him, oh, if you don't have that day to remember by the day He brought you out, I would want to be checking to make sure. You mark the day. Celebration. Mark the day. Consecration. Listen, before we head the journey, you need to make sure that you're ready to consecrate yourself to God. Mark the day. Number 2. Remember the bones of faith. Remember the bones of faith. That's an interesting story about the bones of Joseph. The bones of Joseph. Remember Joseph, before they went into slavery? Joseph was sold by his brothers. We know the story. We spent a lot of time looking at that when we went through Genesis. Joseph was sold by his brothers as a slave, went to Potiphar's house, lied about by the Potiphar's wife, she's saying he tried to be immoral with her. He was put in prison. In prison, he was forgotten. Then the day came after years of being there that God arranged things so Pharaoh brought him up and he became number 2 in all of Egypt. Oh, he ruled in Egypt, delivering the corn, able to bring his family back to him. Oh, what a marvelous thing, ruling over Egypt for years and years there with his family. And then when he died, let me just read it for you. In Genesis 50 it says, and Joseph said unto his brethren, I die. And God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land which He sware unto Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. He's looking ahead 430 years. He's saying, God's going to deliver you out of this land. God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Joseph says, when you get delivered, 400 years from now, when you get delivered, take my bones. Don't leave my bones here. Don't leave my bones here in Egypt. You take my bones to the promised land. You take my bones to the place where God has promised. You take my bones there and bury me in that promised land. As we'll see in just a moment, Moses took the bones. 430 years later, he took the bones. So Joseph said, take my bones into the promised land. Moses took the bones to the promised land. And Joshua then buried the bones in the promised land. So before they left, on their way out, we need to remember the bones of faith very carefully, very quickly. Notice Joseph and his bones is a faith in the promises of God. Faith in the promises of God. By the way, I'm glad we have the promises of God. And our faith, it must be in those promises. Nearly a third of Genesis is about the life of Joseph and his story. The story of Joseph and his forgiveness. The story of Joseph and his patience. The story of Joseph and his purity. The story of Joseph and his wisdom. But in Hebrews 11, where the hall of faith is, God mentions Joseph, but God does not mention Joseph's wisdom. God does not mention Joseph's purity. God does not mention Joseph's forgiveness of his brother. He does not mention every aspect of his life and what an influential life. In Hebrews 11:22 it says, by faith. And we're talking about making this journey by faith. By faith Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. God said, I'm going to brag on Joseph and his faith. He said he had faith to forgive. Aren't you glad? Let me put it this way. It takes faith to forgive people. It takes faith to really forgive them. Joseph looked at his brothers and says, God worked it to good. I'm in the place of God. You meant for evil. Boy, he's able to forgive. But God didn't, in Hebrews, applaud his faith to forgive. He did not applaud his faith to be pure. When Potiphar's wife said, come lie with me, and he says, no, I can't sin against God. I've got to keep myself pure. God didn't mention that by faith he did that. He didn't mention in faith he was there in prison still serving God. What he did mention was that he had faith in God's promise. He says, when you go 400 years from now, 430 years from now, take my bones with you. Oh, he had faith in the promises of God. You and I need, ladies and gentlemen, we need to, if we're going to be on a journey, we've got to have faith in the promises of God. Amen. Faith in His promise. Remember the bones of faith. For Joseph, his bones represented faith in the promises of God. He said, Abraham, great-great-great-grandpa Abraham, God promised him, He promised his son and our daddy, and I know He's going to keep His promise. And He says, so when you go, you take my bones. I think it's there in your notes. His home had been Egypt. But all except for those first 16, 17 years of his life, he had been in Egypt. He had served in Egypt. He lived in Egypt. He had his wife and kids in Egypt. He ruled in Egypt. But when it came down to it, his heart was not in Egypt. His heart was in Canaan land. Ladies and gentlemen, that's how you and I ought to be living. We may be living here, but our heart needs to be there. We may be stuck here, but our heart needs to be there. We need to be focused on things to come. Faith in the promises of God. It was a lifelong faith that he had. Remember the bones of faith. Joseph, his faith was in the promises of God. A long way off, far off. Say, preacher, how in the world can I keep going on that journey between here and where God wants me to go? Having faith in His promises, a long way off. Moses and Joseph's bones is faith in the presence. Faith in the present. Joseph, listen, his bones represented faith in the future. The promises. Well, guess what? I'm going to live in heaven forever. Amen. You're not excited about it. You're going to live in heaven forever. A little more excited. That's right. Who cares about the preacher? As long as I'm there. That's way up there. Jesus is coming back. The rapture is going to happen. Glory. I don't know when. It may be tomorrow, maybe next year, maybe 30 years. But the promises of the future, I go in my journey now, remembering because the bones represent the faith in the promises to come. But then Moses and Joseph's bones, reminds us about the faith in the present. In Exodus 13:19, it says, on their way out, and you can look at it right there, Exodus 13:19. Verse number 18, but God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up harnessed out of the land of Egypt. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. For he had straitly sworn the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones every away hence with you. So Moses on the way out, okay, this is the night. Mark the day. We're delivered. We're saved. We're out of here. Headed to the promised land. Glory. Moses said, wait a minute. I gotta get some bones. I got to get Joseph's bones and bring them with us. So Moses had faith in the present and the practical. The present and the practical. It's a faith that carries. Joseph was a faith that commits. Moses is a faith that carries. Boy, he said, I got to carry. In other words, Moses was saying, I'm in God's plan. Joseph had faith in the promises to come. I hope you got faith in the promises to come. I hope you've got faith in the promises of God. And that's what Joseph said. When he comes, you carry my bones. Moses said, I got faith in the present, that I'm still in God's plan, that this is what God planned for me. This is what time God has us live. This is the day we're living in. He said, I got to get Joseph's bones, and I'm taking it with him. Aren't you glad you're in the plan of God? That's faith in the present and the responsibilities we have. Here's a quick question. How did Moses know that? That was 430 years ago Joseph said that. If I ask you today what somebody asked somebody else to do 430 years ago, you'd be pretty hard-pressed to figure it out. But Moses said, no, I got to get the bones. Because, he told him. How did he know it? Because he had the same promises. That he's going to the promised land. He had heard about the same promises. He had had the same preaching. He had parents training him. His parents had told them, and the parents before that, and the parents before that. It was passed down. It was the same promises they had, and the fact that it was training going on about Joseph and the promises and his bones. Can you imagine? Joseph, 430 years later, his faith is still affecting people. His faith is still having an impact on people. His faith is something that people are still stirred by. 430 years later. Ladies and gentlemen, I looked at that and I have to ask, will my faith affect anybody beyond my life? Will my faith affect anybody's behavior beyond my life? Will my kids be affected by my faith? Will my grandchildren be affected by my faith? Will the people of the church be affected by my faith? Joseph, 430 years before, said, remember my bones. By faith, he said, God's going to take you out. 430 years later, said, we remember his faith. Boy, moms and dads, let's live so at least our kids will remember our faith. Will be impacted by our faith. He carried them because of respect. He carried them because of his responsibility. He carried them out. Remember the bones of faith. Why? Getting ready to leave the journey. Getting ready to go and depart from here. Here we go. Mark the day. Mark the day you're saved. Mark the day you're delivered. Mark the day God showed his power and his compassion and his grace. Mark the day. He said, but also don't forget the bones of faith. Don't forget to live and go in faith. You know they carried his bones for 40 years? They get out in the wilderness, and because they wouldn't go to the promised land for 40 years, somebody had to carry those bones, Joseph's bones. When God would move them from one spot to another, no doubt somebody would say, whose turn is it to carry Joseph's bones? I did it yesterday. It's not my turn. He never has to carry the bones. I don't know how it went. Or maybe they fought over who gets to carry Joseph's bones. Whoa, we're headed to the promised land. How do you know? I'm carrying the bones of the man who saw it, the man who believed it, the man who believed it and committed in faith to go in there. Very quickly, Joshua and Joseph's bones. We'll be done. Joshua and Joseph's bones is faith in the perfection. Faith in perfection. In other words, it's a faith that's completed. In Joshua 24:32, after the wilderness, after 40 years in the wilderness, going into the promised land, and the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, they buried in Shechem, a parcel of ground which Jacob, Joseph's dad, bought of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, and it became the inheritance of the children of Joseph. When they finally get to the promised land and Moses is no more on the scene, Moses has died, Joshua's taken over, and they've gone to the promised land, guess what? They still got Joseph's bones. And they buried him in the promised land that he asked for. That's a faith that completes. It's done. A faith in perfection, the completion of the plan. Oh, I want to challenge you. We need faith in the promises of God. We need faith in the presence right now that we're in now, that God's still working. God's still got a plan. God's still got those promises. We got faith in the present time that we're going to get those bones and carry that faith with us. And then also that God's going to take us to completion, all the way to the end. So how does that apply to me? We've got to be carrying our work all the way to the end, passing the baton. In Hebrews 11, where it talked about Joseph, it said, all these, and these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. In other words, he says, they followed by faith, they lived by faith. He said, but they're counting on us to carry on the faith to the end, because their journey did not finish. They passed it on to us. So we're carrying the baton. Are you listening to me? You and I are carrying the baton of Joseph. You and I are carrying the baton of Moses. You and I are carrying the baton of the New Testament church. We are in that path, and we're headed in faith to perfection, to the end of God's plan, to the end of God's glory, to the end. I'm glad I've got a baton to half off. Here, Joshua said, here's these bones. He said, I didn't pick them up. Moses picked them up. Moses, why did you pick them up? Because Joseph asked us to, because Joseph was going to take us to the promised land. By the way, Joseph knew so much he didn't let himself. How many know that the kings of Egypt were buried in usually pyramids, locked up and sealed. Joseph says, not this boy. You put me in a coffin because I'm leaving. Wow. Being such a leader in those times, he would have been embalmed and put in some pyramid, but no, he said, I'm out of here. We're passing the baton of faith, passing on the truth. 2 Timothy 2:2. And the things thou have heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. Man, we've just got to remember the bones of faith. As Joseph says, I'm looking ahead to the promises of God. I'm claiming God's promises, and I believe it so much, I'm making you promise me to take me out of here. Moses had faith in the present. He said, man, here we are. Just like he saw in the head, I'm now in the present, and I have faith in the present. Let's live with the presence of faith in our lives all the way to actually put him in the ground over in the promised land. And old Joshua did that. Boy, that is perfection and completion. Woo! Said, preacher, I'm struggling on my journey to the promised land. Did you start right? Did you start right? Here we go, he said. Number one, mark the day. I can look back in my life the day I got saved. And though there's been struggle, I've not been perfect, and and all these things in my life have not turned out maybe like I wanted to. Man, I can go back and mark the day he saved me. And I became his child. And as long as I'm serving him, nothing else matters. I'm his and he's mine. But then before I left, if I'm going to make it through the journey, I need to consecrate. I need to say, yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. What I have is yours. What you want is yours. And then I need to have the faith, like old Joseph's bones. God didn't put that in there by happenstance, that Joseph said, take my bones, that he told us Moses took his bones, that Joshua buried his bones. Oh, you'll be glad when you get to the end of the trip. When it comes time to die, Joseph said, I die. He said, I'm dying. This is it. It's all over. If today was the day, you knew today you were going to die, what would your concern be? Well, a lot of people say, I didn't get to go to the Bahamas. I didn't have a big enough house. I didn't get my bucket list done. I'm scared and I'm nervous. Not Joseph. He said, I'm dying. Take my bones to the promised land. In other words, he had a focus on the future. He had a focus on the promises of God. How could he have that assurance? How could he have that peace? He said, I'm dying. He didn't say, oh, make sure this is taken care of. No, he said, just take my bones to the promised land. Because he lived a life of faith, believing and serving God. You want to be ready? You want to have that kind of assurance? You live your life like Joseph, all for God. Living for God. Living by his promises. Living by truth. And the day comes and you say, I'm dying, but I'm just passing through. I'll be with him today. Mark the day. Not saved? Just, as the Bible talks about, verify that you're in the faith. Make sure you're saved. Mark the day. Remember the faith. The bones of faith. Let's bow our heads, please. Father, we thank you so much for your word. Lord, I see Christians, people that are saved, that are struggling so hard on their journey. Lord, maybe because they just didn't start out right. Maybe they've never consecrated themselves and realized that it's our reasonable service to give to you, to be sacrifices unto you. Or maybe they've never had that real start date. They've never really been saved. They've never really been delivered. They've never really been set free. Lord, I don't know the need, but if somebody here this morning is not saved, Lord, help them get saved. For those of us that are saved, help us realize that we need to be on that journey. And if we've gotten off the journey, to get back on, or maybe we just need to reset some things that we did not have quite in place before we set out on the course. Lord, I don't know the need this morning, but you do. I know how you've spoken to my heart. So, Father, please work. We ask this in Jesus' precious name. As we stand to our feet and while the instruments play, if you're not saved, if you can't mark the day. For me, I was age 19. I can't remember the exact day. It was in February and March in Norfolk, Virginia. At the naval base underneath the tree in front of the bowling alley, reading a Gideon New Testament. My wife had been witnessing to me. I've had preachers witness to me. My friends had told me about it, but it just didn't make sense. But the Holy Spirit opened my eyes there in that tree, under that tree, there in that Norfolk Naval Base, and I realized I was a sinner headed for hell, but Jesus paid the price, and I called upon Him, and He saved me. I marked that day. Whoa! Things have not always been, I've not been like I should have been all those years since then, but I've been saved since then. I marked the day. I marked the day where I came to the old-fashioned altar and I said, God, I don't have much, but whatever I have is yours. Whatever you want, I'm giving myself to you. I'm giving it all to you. I'm giving you all I have. That's that consecration. As God says, I want the first ones. As a picture of what I've done for you. He said, when your son comes and say, Dad, why are we sacrificing this first animal? He said, because God saved us. God brought us out of Egypt. And it's a reminder of what He's done. If you're not saved, you need to get saved. If you are saved, have you consecrated yourself to God? You say, God, whatever you want. Maybe you just don't have the faith. You're not focused on the promises. You're not focused on our duties, the present day. I don't know, just faith as we head to the journeys. If you're not saved, you step out right now of a man.